put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Merchant of Death. In the summer of 2008, the Royal Thai Police raided room 5120 of the Sofitel Hotel in Bangkok. They weren't looking for drugs. They weren't hunting a terrorist. They were there to arrest a businessman, a man who called himself Victor Bout, though that was just one of 47 aliases he used across 6 different passports. The agents found him casually eating dinner, discussing what appeared to be a routine cargo deal. But this was no ordinary cargo. The merchandise Victor Bout trafficked didn't sit in warehouses or ship on commercial manifests. It killed people, thousands of them, and the empire he built to move this merchandise, a labyrinth of shell companies, phantom airlines, and ghost banks scattered across 4 continents, represented perhaps the most sophisticated criminal business structure ever constructed. This is the dark business story of the man the United Nations called the Merchant of Death, the arms dealer who proved that in the shadows of global commerce, anything can be bought, anything can be sold, and the only currency that truly matters is the willingness to operate where governments fear to tread. Victor Bout didn't start as a villain in a business thriller. He started as a Soviet military intelligence officer, a linguist who spoke 6 languages fluently, and a logistics specialist who understood something most people never grasp. The world runs on transportation. Not ideas, not innovation. Transportation. Move the right things to the right places at the right time, and you control everything. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it didn't just fall, it hemorrhaged. Military bases across Eastern Europe and Central Asia emptied overnight, leaving behind warehouses filled with weapons that officially no longer existed because the government that purchased them had ceased to be. Bout saw what others missed, the greatest fire sale in human history, and absolutely no one watching the inventory. But here's where the real business scandal begins, where Bout separated himself from common criminals and entered the realm of criminal genius. He didn't just steal weapons and sell them to the highest bidder. He built a corporation, a legitimate-looking, impossibly complex, utterly untraceable global business empire designed specifically to move illegal arms while appearing on every official document to be nothing more than a network of small cargo airlines. The genius of Victor Bout wasn't violence, it was corporate structure. Between 1992 and 2008, Bout created over 60 companies scattered across the world, like a constellation designed to confuse rather than illuminate. AirSes in South Africa, SANair in Swaziland, Centrafrican Airlines in the Central African Republic, Trans Aviation Network in Tajikistan. Each company owned aircraft. Each aircraft had registration numbers and flight plans. Each cargo manifest looked routine: machine parts, farming equipment, textiles, mining supplies. But beneath this facade of mundane commercial aviation lay something far darker. Bout understood a fundamental loophole in international law. Countries track companies, not cargo. If a plane registered to AirSes took off from South Africa, loaded with agricultural equipment, landed in Liberia to refuel, then continued to Sierra Leone to deliver mining machinery, who would question it? The answer: no one, as long as the paperwork aligned. And Bout made sure the paperwork always aligned. He employed a network of lawyers, accountants, and logistics coordinators who understood how to exploit the gaps between national jurisdictions. A shell company in Liberia, owned by a holding company in the British Virgin Islands, managed by a trust in Liechtenstein, operating aircraft registered in Equatorial Guinea, carrying cargo manifested in the United Arab Emirates. Try to investigate that chain, and you'll spend years navigating 8 different legal systems, none of which communicate with each other. This wasn't just business crime. It was corporate architecture as an art form, a masterclass in how complex structures can create perfect invisibility. But moving weapons was only half the equation. Bout's real innovation, the business secret that allowed him to operate for 16 years while multiple governments actively hunted him, was his mastery of financial invisibility. Traditional arms dealers face a simple problem. Blood money is hard to clean. Sell $10 million worth of AK-47s to a warlord, and suddenly you have $10 million that can't be deposited in Bank of America without triggering every red flag in the federal banking system. Bout solved this through a network of shell banks and correspondent accounts that made his money as untraceable as his aircraft. He didn't use major banks, at least not directly. Instead, he funneled money through small regional banks in countries with weak financial oversight. Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, Kigali in Rwanda, offshore accounts in the Seychelles and Vanuatu. These banks would then use their correspondent relationships with larger European and American banks to move money into the legitimate financial system. Each transaction small enough to avoid scrutiny. Each connection broken enough to prevent anyone from connecting the dots. According to United Nations investigators, Bout moved an estimated $6 billion through this system between 1996 and 2008, money that paid for wars in Angola, Sierra Leone, Liberia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Afghanistan. And yet, on paper, Victor Bout appeared to be nothing more than a modestly successful cargo entrepreneur with a fondness for operating in difficult markets. The wealth was there, hidden in plain sight, moving through legitimate channels, protected by corporate veils and banking secrecy laws. This was entrepreneurship secrets at their darkest, a lesson in how the global financial system's complexity can be weaponized by someone who understands it better than the regulators trying to police it. But here's where this dark business story takes its most disturbing turn, the part that transforms Victor Bout from criminal mastermind into something far more unsettling. Victor Bout didn't just sell weapons to warlords and rebels. He sold them to governments, to the same governments that were supposedly hunting him. According to declassified documents and testimony from UN investigators, Bout's aircraft were regularly contracted by the United States Department of Defense and its coalition partners to transport military cargo into Iraq and Afghanistan during the early 2000s. The very same planes that had delivered weapons to the Taliban in 2000, cargo documented in UN sanctions reports, were being paid by American taxpayers to deliver supplies to American soldiers in 2004. This wasn't incompetence. This was necessity. Bout controlled one of the largest fleets of Soviet-era cargo aircraft in the world, ancient Antonov and Ilyushin planes that could land on unpaved runways in remote locations where Western aircraft couldn't operate. When the US needed cargo moved into hostile territory quickly and quietly, Bout's shell companies got the contracts, often through third-party brokers who either didn't know or didn't care about the ownership chain. The French government used his planes in Africa. The British used them in Sierra Leone. The UN itself, the organization that had Victor Bout on a sanctions list, inadvertently contracted his aircraft for peacekeeping operations because the shell company structure made it impossible to trace ownership. This is the hidden truth behind billionaire secrets in the arms trade. The line between criminal and contractor is often drawn not by morality, but by political convenience. Bout understood that governments operate in moral gray zones too, that when you control a resource they desperately need, questions about your past customers become inconvenient details to be handled by a different department. He became untouchable, not because he was invisible, but because he was useful, and that usefulness bought him years of operation, while his name appeared on every international watch list. But who was Victor Bout beneath the aliases and shell companies? What kind of person builds a business empire on weapons that kill children? Those who met him describe a man utterly divorced from the consequences of his business model. A brilliant logistics mind who saw weapons as nothing more than cargo, deals as nothing more than contracts, wars as nothing more than market opportunities. In intercepted conversations, Bout spoke about surface-to-air missiles, the way a produce distributor discusses tomatoes, product, demand, delivery schedules, payment terms. This psychological detachment is perhaps the most chilling lesson in this business scandal documentary. Bout never saw himself as evil. He saw himself as a service provider, operating in an underserved market. When asked in a 2002 interview how he justified his work, he responded with genuine confusion. "I'm a businessman. I transport cargo. What that cargo is used for is not my concern." It's the same moral disconnection that appears again and again in stories of corporate greed and financial mystery. The ability to reduce human suffering to a line item, to transform tragedy into transaction, to build spreadsheets where the cells containing death counts don't trigger emotional response, only logistical consideration. But Bout's detachment went further. He was charming, even likable according to many who dealt with him. He spoke eloquently about his family, his love of languages, his appreciation for classical music. The cognitive dissonance was complete. A cultured man who could discuss Dostoevsky over dinner, then arrange the delivery of rocket-propelled grenades to rebels who would use them to massacre villages before dessert arrived. Meanwhile, governments struggled to stop what they couldn't understand. The challenge wasn't identifying Victor Bout. Intelligence agencies knew exactly who he was by the mid-1990s. The challenge was proving it in a way that survived legal scrutiny. Bout's corporate structure exploited a fundamental flaw in international law. There is no global corporate registry. Each country maintains its own business records, and those records don't communicate with each other in any systematic way. A shell company in Liberia has no legal obligation to disclose its owners to authorities in Belgium. An aircraft registered in Equatorial Guinea can be operated by a company in the UAE without triggering any automatic reporting requirements. This is the dark side of business globalization. The same regulatory fragmentation that allows multinational corporations to legally minimize taxes also allows criminal enterprises to operate across borders with near impunity. Bout simply took the optimization strategies of legitimate business and applied them to an illegitimate product. UN investigators spent years trying to map his network, producing reports hundreds of pages long, detailing the connections between companies, aircraft, bank accounts, and cargo routes. But by the time they documented one shell company, Bout had already dissolved it and created 3 more. By the time they traced one aircraft, it had been re-registered under a different name in a different country. Regulation, they learned, cannot move as fast as money when money is motivated by billions in profit and protected by corporate structures specifically designed for speed and opacity. But here's what the corporate structure hid, what Victor Bout's financial mystery deliberately obscured with shell companies and phantom airlines. Behind every aircraft manifest, behind every wire transfer, behind every seemingly routine cargo delivery, there were bodies. Real human bodies, destroyed by the product Victor Bout transported with such logistical precision. In 1998, Bout's aircraft delivered surface-to-air missiles to rebels in Angola. 2 weeks later, those missiles shot down 2 United Nations relief planes, killing all crew members. The planes were carrying medical supplies to civilians trapped by the fighting, civilians who would die because the medicine never arrived, killed indirectly by the same weapons that killed the aid workers directly. In 2000, Bout's planes transported weapons to both sides of the civil war in Sierra Leone, a conflict that became infamous for rebels who cut off the hands and arms of civilians, including children, as a terror tactic. UN investigators estimated that Bout's deliveries extended that war by at least 2 years, resulting in approximately 50,000 additional deaths, and over 20,000 amputations. In Liberia, weapons trafficked through Bout's network armed Charles Taylor's forces during a civil war characterized by the use of child soldiers, children as young as 8 forced to carry the AK-47s that arrived on Bout's aircraft, forced to commit atrocities that would traumatize them for life. This is the cost of Victor Bout's $6 billion empire, the bodies that don't appear in profit and loss statements, the suffering that exists in the gap between delivered cargo and payment received. Every corporate scandal documentary focuses on money, but this real-life business story demands we look at what money bought. Rape as a weapon of war, villages burned, mass graves, generations destroyed. And Bout's shell companies ensured he never had to see it. The corporate veil didn't just protect him legally, it protected him psychologically, creating layers of administrative distance between the man signing contracts and the children bleeding out in African villages. This is the real lesson about wealth and power that business schools don't teach. Complex corporate structures don't just hide money, they hide consequences, allowing individuals to profit from horror without having to witness it, to build fortunes on suffering without having to acknowledge the screams. By 2008, Victor Bout had become untouchable through traditional law enforcement methods. Every attempt to arrest him had failed because he never stayed in countries with functioning extradition treaties. And when he did, his shell company lawyers could tie up proceedings for years in local courts. So the United States decided to create a crime that didn't exist yet. Agents working with informants posed as representatives of FARC, the Colombian rebel group designated as a terrorist organization by the United States. They contacted Bout through intermediaries and requested a meeting to discuss a massive weapons purchase: surface-to-air missiles, armor-piercing rocket launchers, millions of rounds of ammunition. The purpose, they explained, was to kill American soldiers and DEA agents in Colombia. For 16 years, Victor Bout had sold weapons to anyone with money, but he'd been careful never to explicitly target Americans. His entire business model relied on operating in legal gray zones, conflicts the international community had forgotten, wars in countries without strong American interests, deals that could be rationalized as merely supplying demand in underserved markets. But in March 2008, Victor Bout flew to Bangkok to meet with the supposed FARC representatives. In a conversation recorded by DEA agents, he agreed to sell weapons explicitly intended to kill Americans. "We have the same enemy," he told the undercover agents, referring to the United States. It was the first time in 16 years that Victor Bout had made a mistake. The first time the man who built an empire on corporate structure and calculated invisibility had allowed emotion to override business calculation. And that single error was enough. On March 6, 2008, Thai police arrested him in room 5120 of the Sofitel Hotel. After 2 years of legal battles, he was extradited to the United States. In 2012, he was convicted of conspiracy to kill Americans and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. But here's what makes this business thriller truly chilling. Victor Bout's arrest changed almost nothing. The shell companies still exist, now operated by associates and family members. The aircraft still fly, re-registered and repainted, but serving the same markets. The weapons still flow, because the demand didn't disappear when Bout entered prison. It just created an opportunity for someone else to fill the vacuum. UN investigators estimate that at least 15 of Bout's former associates now run their own arms trafficking networks using the exact corporate structure he pioneered. Shell companies in weak jurisdictions, phantom airlines with constantly changing registrations, bank accounts in offshore havens, cargo manifests that describe weapons as machine parts or agricultural equipment. The system Bout built proved to be his greatest creation, a business model so effective, so brilliantly designed to exploit gaps in international law, that it survived the arrest of its creator and became the template for an entire industry. This is the ultimate rise and fall paradox. Victor Bout fell, but his empire's architecture remained, teaching a new generation of arms dealers exactly how to build corporate structures that governments cannot penetrate, that regulators cannot map, that investigators cannot dismantle. But even prison couldn't end Victor Bout's story. In December 2022, after serving 10 years of his sentence, he became valuable again, not for his weapons or his corporate structure, but as a bargaining chip in international diplomacy's darkest transactions. Russia wanted him back. The United States wanted WNBA star Brittany Griner released from Russian detention. And so, in a prisoner exchange that would have seemed absurd if it weren't so darkly appropriate, the merchant of death was traded for a basketball player, arrested for carrying cannabis oil. Victor Bout walked off a plane in Moscow a free man, greeted by Russian officials and media as a wrongfully imprisoned patriot rather than a convicted arms dealer responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. Within weeks, he was giving interviews claiming his conviction was politically motivated, his business model misunderstood, his entire career nothing more than legitimate cargo operations, mischaracterized by Western bias. The corporate scandal had come full circle. The man who used shell companies to hide his crimes now used political theater to rewrite his history, transforming from criminal to victim in the same way his companies had transformed weapons into agricultural equipment on cargo manifests. So what does this dark business story teach us about money and greed, about corporate structure, about the machinery of global commerce? Victor Bout proved that in the modern world, corporate complexity is the ultimate weapon, more powerful than guns, more dangerous than bombs, more effective at enabling evil than any ideology. Shell companies don't just hide money, they hide responsibility. They create administrative distance between decision and consequence, between profit and suffering, between the spreadsheet and the body count. He proved that international law is fundamentally unequipped to handle businesses that operate in the gaps between jurisdictions, that move faster than regulation, that use the tools of legitimate commerce to facilitate illegitimate horror. And most disturbingly, he proved that governments operate in the same moral gray zones they publicly condemn, that when usefulness outweighs ethics, when logistical necessity trumps legal principle, even the merchant of death can become a government contractor. His aircraft carrying supplies for the same soldiers, his weapons were killing in different conflicts. This is the stock market secrets of the arms trade, the hidden entrepreneurship secrets behind blood diamonds and conflict minerals. Create enough corporate layers, operate in enough jurisdictions, control resources that powerful entities desperately need, and you become too valuable to stop, too complex to prosecute, too useful to eliminate. Victor Bout didn't fail because his business model was flawed. He succeeded for 16 years precisely because the model was perfect. He failed because he made one emotional decision, one departure from pure calculation, one moment where he said yes to killing Americans, instead of maintaining plausible deniability. And even that failure was temporary, ending with a prisoner exchange that returned him to freedom and transformed him into a political symbol rather than a cautionary tale. The file on Victor Bout's empire sits in archives now, thousands of pages documenting shell companies and aircraft registrations and bank transfers that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Investigators spent years creating those documents, connecting dots across continents, mapping a network so complex it required flowcharts dozens of feet wide to visualize. But in small offices in Dubai, in anonymous buildings in Sharjah, in unmarked warehouses near airports in Tajikistan and the Central African Republic, Victor Bout's students continue the work. They've learned the lessons he taught through his corporate architecture. Complexity is protection, jurisdictional gaps are opportunities, and governments can be clients just as easily as warlords if you control the right resources. The weapons still flow. The shell companies still hide ownership. The aircraft still land on remote runways with cargo manifests that describe death as farming equipment. Because Victor Bout's real legacy wasn't the $6 billion he made or the conflicts he fueled. It was proving that in a globalized world with fragmented regulation, corporate structure itself can become a weapon more powerful than anything he ever transported. And that weapon, unlike Victor Bout himself, remains at large, loaded, and waiting for the next person brilliant enough and ruthless enough to use it. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.